Welcome back. If you're settling in after a long day, perhaps with a cup of tea and a bit of quiet, you're exactly where you should be. This channel exists for moments like these, when the world slows down and you're looking for something thoughtful, something that doesn't shout. Tonight, we're going somewhere most documentaries don't. Not the pyramids, not Stonehenge, not Machu Picchu. Those places have been examined, debated, and documented endlessly. Instead, we're focusing on the places that never made it into the textbooks, ruins that sit in near silence, studied by only a small circle of specialists, many of whom openly admit they don't yet have clear answers. What happens when a structure is so precisely built, so carefully engineered, that even with modern tools, we still struggle to understand how it was made? Not because the instructions were lost, but because the methods were never fully understood. These are the sites that don't fit neatly into the timeline, the ones that make engineers pause and archaeologists choose their words carefully. Some were built by cultures we can barely name, others by civilizations that vanished before their story was ever written down. And they raise an uncomfortable question. What if ancient people knew more than we think? Tonight, we'll explore 11 such places, spread across 4 continents, sites that continue to challenge modern explanations and leave critical questions unresolved. This isn't a story about aliens or lost mythologies. It's about evidence, stone, craftsmanship, and the humbling possibility that some knowledge has been lost to time. So get comfortable and let's begin. Northern Mexico. The year is 1340, give or take a decade. In a sun-baked valley near what is now the border town of Casas Grandes, a civilization is thriving. Not the Aztecs, not the Maya. Something else entirely. They call the place Paquimé. At its height, Paquimé was home to several thousand people. It had multi-story adobe buildings, some reaching 4 or 5 levels, constructed with a sophistication that rivals anything built in the American Southwest. But that's not what makes it strange. What makes Paquimé strange is the plumbing. Walk through the ruins today, and you'll find remnants of an advanced water distribution system. Aqueducts that brought water from distant springs, underground channels that regulated temperature, bathing pools, drainage systems. Some archaeologists believe the people of Paquimé even had heated floors, radiant heating, centuries before Europeans thought of it. But here's where it gets interesting. Paquimé wasn't just a city, it was a production center, specifically a center for working copper, on a scale and with a level of skill that doesn't fit the narrative we've been told about pre-Columbian North America. The people here made copper bells, thousands of them, small, intricately cast, with internal clappers that rang with a pure, clear tone. These weren't crude hammered pieces. They were cast using lost wax techniques, a process that requires precise temperature control, an understanding of metallurgy, and access to high-quality materials. And they didn't stop at bells, axes, ornaments, thin sheets of copper so fine they could be bent without breaking. The kind of metalwork that requires not just skill, but infrastructure, furnaces, molds, a steady supply of ore, a network of artisans who understood chemistry and heat in ways that shouldn't have been possible for a culture that, according to the textbooks, was still in the Stone Age. But Paquimé's copper isn't its only mystery. There's also the architecture itself. The walls weren't built the way you'd expect. They didn't stack mud bricks. They used a technique called coursed adobe. layers of wet earth mixed with stone, poured into wooden forms, then left to dry in the sun. The result was walls that were thick, strong, and almost monolithic. Some of them are still standing, more than 6 centuries later. Modern engineers have tried to replicate the technique. They've failed. The walls crack, they slump, they erode within years. Whatever the people of Paquimé understood about soil composition, moisture content, and structural integrity, it's knowledge we've lost. And then there's the layout. Paquimé was planned, not haphazardly built over generations, but designed, possibly all at once, with a level of urban planning that seems out of place for its time. The buildings align with cardinal directions. The plazas are proportional. The whole thing feels intentional in a way that suggests either a single visionary architect or a society with a deep, shared understanding of space and function. But who were these people? Where did they come from? The conventional answer is that they were influenced by cultures to the south, perhaps Mesoamerican traders who brought ideas and techniques north. But that doesn't explain everything. The copperworking at Paquimé is different, more refined in some ways. And the architecture, while it shares some similarities with sites farther south, has its own distinct character. By 1450, Paquimé was gone. Not gradually, suddenly. The city was burned. Some archaeologists think it was warfare, maybe with nomadic groups from the north. Others think it might have been internal collapse, a resource crisis, or a prolonged drought that made the valley uninhabitable. No one knows. What we do know is that the people left, and they took their knowledge with them. The techniques for working copper at that scale, for building those walls, for managing water in a desert, it all vanished. And here's the haunting part. We've found copper trade goods from Paquimé as far north as Colorado, as far south as central Mexico. This wasn't an isolated village. It was a hub, a center of production and exchange that linked distant cultures across 1,000 miles. So why don't we talk about it? Because it complicates things. It suggests that North America, long before European contact, had complex trade networks, advanced metallurgy, and urban planning that we're only beginning to understand. And if we can't even rebuild their walls, what else did they know that we've forgotten? Ecuador. The name Ingapirca means Inca wall, and most tourists who visit the site come to see exactly that. The famous Temple of the Sun, an elliptical structure built with the precision the Inca were known for. Tight-fitting stones, no mortar, earthquake-resistant design. But that's not where the real mystery is. Walk a few hundred meters away from the temple, into the areas most visitors never see, and you'll find something else. Lesser structures, foundations, walls that don't quite fit the Inca style, stones that were clearly shaped and placed with care, but using techniques that feel different. The Inca built Ingapirca in the 15th century, probably as a tambo, a rest stop along the great Inca road system that stretched for thousands of miles. But they didn't build it on empty land. They built it on top of something older, the Cañari people. The Cañari controlled this region for centuries before the Inca arrived. They were a powerful, organized society, sophisticated enough to resist Inca expansion for decades. When the Inca finally conquered them, they didn't erase their culture. They built on top of it, literally. And that's where things get murky. Because when you start looking at the lesser structures at Ingapirca, the ones that predate the Inca presence, you realize we don't really know how they were built. The stones aren't massive, not like Sacsayhuaman or Ollantaytambo, but they're shaped, not crudely pounded into place, but cut, ground down, fitted together with an understanding of weight distribution and stability that doesn't match the technology we think the Cañari had access to. No iron tools, no bronze chisels, as far as we know, just stone pounders and maybe copper implements, soft metals that should have taken years to shape granite and andesite with this level of accuracy. And yet here it is. Some archaeologists believe the Cañari built these foundations using a technique involving water and thermal shock, heating stones with fire, then rapidly cooling them with water to create fractures along desired lines. It's a plausible theory. Indigenous groups in other parts of the world used similar methods, but no one's been able to prove it. And more importantly, no one's been able to replicate it with the same level of precision. There's another problem. The lesser structures don't all match each other. Some walls use tightly fitted stones. Others use a rubble-fill technique with a veneer of cut stone on the outside. A few sections show evidence of multiple building phases: construction, collapse, reconstruction, sometimes using the same stones, sometimes introducing new ones. It suggests that Ingapirca wasn't just built once. It was built, rebuilt, and modified over centuries by people who didn't leave written records, people whose construction techniques evolved, adapted, or were lost and rediscovered multiple times. And here's what makes it even stranger. Some of the stones in the lesser structures show tool marks that don't match any known pre-Columbian technology. Fine, parallel grooves, like they were cut with something sharp and straight. Not ground, not pounded, cut. Modern archaeologists don't like to talk about this, because if you acknowledge that the marks exist, you have to explain them. And the explanations either sound too speculative, or they force you to admit that these people had capabilities we don't fully understand. The Inca, when they arrived, clearly respected what they found. They didn't tear it down. They incorporated it, built their temple right on top of the Cañari foundations, as if acknowledging that this was already sacred ground. But why? What did they see here that made them choose this spot? Some researchers think Ingapirca was an astronomical site. The layout aligns with certain solar events, solstices, equinoxes. The Cañari, like many Andean cultures, were keen observers of the sky. They tracked the movements of the sun and stars, used them to guide agricultural cycles, religious ceremonies, and possibly even political decisions. But again, proving it is another matter. The alignments are suggestive, but not definitive. And the lesser structures, which might hold the real clues, have been so eroded, so overgrown, so picked apart by time and neglect, that reconstructing their original purpose is nearly impossible. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We've spent so much time focusing on the Inca that we've barely scratched the surface of the cultures that came before them. The Cañari built Ingapirca, but we don't know how. We don't know why. And we don't know what they knew that we've forgotten. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some knowledge isn't meant to be preserved in books. Maybe it lives in the stones themselves. And when we stop listening, we stop learning. Siberia, the southern edge of the Tuva Republic, near the border with Mongolia. The landscape here is unforgiving. Endless forest, sub-zero winters, mosquito-choked summers, and in the middle of a lake so remote that even locals rarely visit it, an island. On that island, something impossible. Por-Bazhyn. In the Tuvan language, it means clay house. But that name doesn't do it justice. This isn't a house, it's a fortress, or maybe a palace, or maybe something else entirely, because no one knows what it was for. The structure was built sometime in the mid-8th century. We know this from dendrochronology, tree ring dating of the wooden posts that once supported the roofs. The builders used Siberian larch, which grew nearby. They felled the trees around the year 750 AD, during the reign of the Uyghur Khaganate. But that's where the certainty ends. The fortress is enormous. The outer wall encloses an area of roughly 7.5 acres. Inside, there are courtyards, passageways, and what appear to be ceremonial halls. The central structure, probably the main building, sits on a raised platform with walls that once stood several meters high, all of it built from clay, not stone, not brick, rammed earth, layer upon layer of clay and sand pounded into wooden forms until it became as hard as concrete. The technique is ancient. Cultures all over the world have used it, but never like this, not on this scale, not in this location. Here's the problem. Por-Bazhyn is in the middle of nowhere. The nearest major settlement, in the 8th century, would have been hundreds of miles away. Transporting thousands of workers, tools, and supplies to this remote island would have been a logistical nightmare. And for what? The fortress shows no signs of permanent habitation, no trash pits, no wells, no kitchens, no latrines, no indication that anyone ever lived here for more than short periods. Russian archaeologists who excavated the site in the early 2000s were baffled. They found almost no artifacts, a few bronze fittings, some fragments of roof tiles. That's it. So if it wasn't a residence, what was it? Some think it was a summer palace, a retreat for a Uyghur Khan, far from the politics and heat of the steppe. Others think it might have been a monastery, a sacred site where shamans or priests conducted rituals away from the distractions of the world. A third theory, quieter, less popular, suggests it might have been an astronomical observatory. The layout of the buildings, the orientation of the walls, the sheer isolation of the location, it all fits the profile of a place designed to watch the sky. But again, no proof, just educated guesses. And then there's the engineering. Building on an island means dealing with water, flooding, erosion, seasonal changes in the lake level. The builders of Por-Bazhyn knew this. They designed drainage channels, raised foundations, reinforced walls. Modern engineers have studied the site. They admit grudgingly that the construction is brilliant. The walls are still standing, despite more than a millennium of freeze-thaw cycles, wind and water. Whatever the builders understood about soil mechanics and structural stability, we've only recently begun to relearn it. But here's the truly strange part. Por-Bazhyn was used for less than 30 years. The wooden structures burned, not in a catastrophic fire, but deliberately, or so it seems. The roof beams were removed, the wooden posts taken down, and then the site was abandoned. No one came back. Why? Was it a political shift? Did the Uyghur Khaganate collapse? Did a rival faction destroy it? Or was it something else? A ritual closure? A deliberate return of the site to the spirits? We don't know. What we do know is that building Por-Bazhyn required knowledge we can barely reconstruct. Not just the labor, though that alone is staggering, but the planning, the logistics, the understanding of materials, climate, and terrain. And all of it for something we can't define. A palace that wasn't lived in, a monastery with no monks, an observatory with no records, a fortress with no enemies. Por-Bazhyn sits there still, untouched, asking a question no one can answer. What were they building? And why did they walk away? Southern Mexico, about 25 miles east of the city of Oaxaca. The landscape here is dry, harsh, beautiful, in a way that takes time to appreciate. And on a hill overlooking the valley, half hidden among the rocks and thorn bush, sits Yagul. Most people who visit come to see the main ruins. The ball court, the palace complex, the tombs carved into the hillside, decorated with geometric patterns that speak to a culture obsessed with symmetry and order. But if you keep climbing, past where the tour groups stop, past where the signs end, you'll find something else. Stone platforms, alignments, markers that seem to point toward specific spots on the horizon, an observatory, or what's left of one. Yagul was built by the Zapotec people, probably around 500 BC, though the site was occupied and modified for more than 1,000 years. The Zapotecs were master astronomers. We know this. Their calendar system was complex, accurate, and tied directly to agricultural cycles and religious ceremonies. But the observatory at Yagul isn't well documented. In fact, most archaeological surveys barely mention it. Why? Because it's hard to explain. The platforms aren't large. They're not decorated. There are no inscriptions, no carvings, nothing that tells us definitively what they were used for. But their placement, that's what catches your attention. Each platform aligns with specific points on the horizon. Not randomly, deliberately. During solstices and equinoxes, the sun rises and sets in direct alignment with these markers. During certain times of the year, Venus, visible just before dawn, appears in exact correlation with other stone placements. The Zapotecs didn't have telescopes. They didn't have lenses, compasses, or modern surveying equipment. What they had was patience. Generations of patient observation. Watching the sky night after night, year after year, until patterns emerged. And those patterns became knowledge. Some of the stones have grooves, shallow channels cut into the surface. Archaeoastronomers believe these were sighting lines. You'd stand in one spot, align your eye with the groove, and watch for celestial events. When the sun or a star appeared at the right point, you'd mark the date. Over time, you'd build a calendar. Simple in concept, staggeringly difficult in execution. But here's where Yagul's observatory becomes genuinely mysterious. It's not just the solar alignments, those are impressive, but other Mesoamerican sites, Monte Alban, just a few miles away for example, have similar features. What makes Yagul different are the stellar alignments. Certain platforms at Yagul align with stars that aren't part of the typical Mesoamerican astronomical canon. Not the Pleiades, not Orion. Stars that modern archaeologists have had to work backward to identify, using computer models to reconstruct what the night sky would have looked like 1,500 years ago. And what they found surprised them. The Zapotecs at Yagul were tracking stars that are barely visible to the naked eye. Faint, distant stars that require excellent eyesight, dark skies, and a reason to care. Why were they watching these stars? We don't know. There are theories, of course. Some researchers think the Zapotecs used these stars as part of their agricultural calendar, tracking them to predict seasonal rains or frost. Others think it might have been religious. a way of mapping the movements of gods or ancestors believed to live in the sky. But there's a third possibility, one that archaeoastronomers are hesitant to commit to publicly. It's possible the Zapotecs were doing pure astronomy, not for agriculture, not for religion, but simply because they wanted to understand the cosmos. And if that's true, it changes how we think about pre-Columbian science. The problem with Yagul's observatory is that it's incomplete, not in the sense that it was never finished, but incomplete in our understanding. The stones are still there, the alignments still work, but the knowledge that went with them, the oral traditions, the training, the reasoning, all of that is gone. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they weren't interested in preserving indigenous astronomy, they were interested in conversion. And so the knowledge keepers, the priests and astronomers who understood these alignments, were scattered, silenced, or killed. The stones remained, but the understanding died. Modern attempts to fully reconstruct what the Zapotecs were doing at Yagul have been only partially successful. We can identify some of the alignments. We can prove that certain events were being tracked, but we can't say with certainty why or how the information was used once it was gathered. And here's the part that should make you pause. These people didn't have computers. They didn't have digital cameras or software that could simulate the sky thousands of years in the future. They had stones, string, and their eyes, and they built a working observatory. Today, if you visit Yagul, you'll see signs pointing you toward the ball court, the tombs, the palace. The observatory isn't marked. There's no information plaque, no guided tour. It's just there, waiting for people curious enough to climb a little higher. And maybe that's fitting, because the people who built it weren't interested in impressing tourists. They were interested in something harder, something more patient. They were interested in the truth, and they were willing to spend lifetimes looking for it. Argentina, the province of Tucumán. The year is 1665. Spanish colonial forces are marching up the Calchaquí Valley, and they're angry. For more than a century, one indigenous group has refused to submit. They've fought, retreated, and fought again. They've held their ground in a place so remote, so defensible, that even with horses and cannons, the Spanish have failed to take it. The place is called Quilmes. Quilmes wasn't a city in the way we usually think of cities. It was a fortress settlement, a defensive stronghold built by the Quilmes people, a branch of the larger Diaguita culture, sometime around 1000 AD. And for 600 years, it worked. The ruins sprawl across more than 70 acres of mountainside. Stone foundations mark where houses once stood. Terraced fields step down the slope. Storage rooms, carved into the rock, still bear the scorch marks of ancient fires. At its height, Quilmes may have housed 5,000 people or more, all of them living in a place designed to resist invasion. The location was chosen carefully. The settlement sits on the eastern slope of the mountain, giving it a commanding view of the valley. Fresh water came from a nearby spring. The terraces allowed them to grow maize, beans, and squash, even on the steep hillside. And the stone walls, some of them still standing nearly 10 feet high, created defensive barriers that funneled attackers into kill zones. But what's remarkable about Quilmes isn't just that it was defensible, it's how it was built. The Quilmes people didn't have metal tools, no iron, no bronze. They shaped these stones using harder stones, andesite pounders, probably, and endless hours of patient grinding. And yet the walls fit together with a precision that rivals much more famous sites. No two stones are the same shape. Each one was shaped individually, ground down until it fit perfectly with its neighbors. The result is a wall that flexes slightly during earthquakes rather than collapsing. A wall that sheds water without mortar. A wall that has stood for 1,000 years. Modern engineers have studied Quilmes. They've tried to replicate the dry stacking technique, and they've discovered something humbling. It's not just about fitting the stones together. It's about understanding weight distribution, load-bearing capacity, and how stone behaves under stress. The Quilmes people understood all of this, without blueprints, without calculators, without formal training in engineering. But the architecture isn't the mystery. The mystery is the knowledge. You see, Quilmes wasn't an isolated village. It was part of a network. The Diaguita culture stretched across hundreds of miles of mountains and valleys, and they built dozens of settlements similar to Quilmes, each one adapted to its local terrain, each one using the same basic construction techniques. That suggests something important. It suggests that the knowledge of how to build like this was standardized, shared, passed down through generations in a way that remained consistent across vast distances. But we have no written records, no manuals, no diagrams. The Diaguita didn't use writing, or if they did, none of it survived. So how did they preserve the knowledge? Oral tradition, most likely. Master builders training apprentices, generations of accumulated experience, encoded in stories, songs, and hands-on teaching. It's a system that works, as long as the culture remains intact. And that's where the tragedy begins. In 1665, after more than a century of resistance, the Spanish finally broke Quilmes. Not through direct assault. The fortress was still too strong for that. They did it through siege. They surrounded the settlement, cut off the water supply, and waited. Starvation did what cannons couldn't. The survivors, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, were forced to march more than 1,000 miles north to the outskirts of Buenos Aires. Most died along the way. Those who survived were resettled in a mission town, where their culture, their language, and their knowledge were systematically dismantled. Within 2 generations, the Quilmes people effectively ceased to exist as a distinct culture, and with them went the knowledge of how to build like this, how to choose stones, how to fit them, how to design a settlement that could resist both human enemies and the slow erosion of time. Today, archaeologists visit Quilmes with measuring tapes and cameras, trying to reverse engineer what the Quilmes people knew instinctively. And they're making progress, slowly. But it's like trying to learn a language by studying a dictionary with half the words missing. You can get the basics, but the nuance, the fluency, that's gone. Here's what haunts me about Quilmes. It's not just that they built something impressive. It's that they built something that lasted. For 1,000 years, those walls stood. Through earthquakes, through floods, through wars. They stood because the people who built them understood their materials, their environment, and the limits of both. We build with steel and concrete now. We have cranes and computers and engineering degrees, and most of what we build won't last 200 years, let alone 1,000. So who's more advanced? The Quilmes people held this fortress for 6 centuries. They raised families here. They farmed impossible slopes. They defended their home against an empire that had conquered half the world. And when they were finally broken, it wasn't because their walls failed. It was because empires don't care about walls. They care about breaking the people inside them. And once the people are gone, the knowledge goes with them. The border between Mexico and Guatemala, deep in the Lacandan jungle, on a horseshoe bend in the Usumacinta River, sits Yaxchilan. If you know Maya archaeology, you know the name. Yaxchilan was a major power during the Classic period, home to kings and warriors, famous for its carved lintels that depict bloodletting rituals and military victories. The main plaza, with its palaces and temples, has been studied extensively, restored, photographed, written about in dozens of academic papers. But that's not where we're going. Walk 15 minutes into the jungle, away from the cleared paths and tourist routes, and you'll find something else. Lesser structures, buildings that were never excavated, walls that have collapsed back into the earth, doorways half buried under centuries of leaf litter and root systems. These aren't minor buildings. Some of them are substantial, multi-room complexes, terraces, platforms that suggest ceremonial importance, but they've been left alone, unstudied, allowed to sink back into the jungle. Why? Funding, politics, priorities. The main plaza at Yaxchilan is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It draws tourists, which brings money. The lesser structures don't. They're too remote, too ruined, too expensive to excavate and maintain. So they sit, waiting. And here's what makes that tragic. Because when you look closely, really look, you start to see things that don't fit the timeline. The stonework in these lesser structures is different. Not wildly different, not obviously different, but subtly different in ways that make archaeologists uncomfortable. Some of the stones are smoother than they should be. Not weathered smooth. That's common in tropical climates, but deliberately smoothed. Ground down to a near polish, with a level of craftsmanship that suggests either exceptional skill or access to better tools than we think the classic Maya had. And then there are the joints, the way the stones fit together. In the main plaza, Maya construction is impressive but understandable. Stones are shaped, fitted, and locked in place using gravity and friction. It's elegant, effective, and well documented. But in some of these lesser structures, the joints are tighter. The tolerance is higher. The level of precision crosses from impressive into bewildering. How? The Maya had stone tools, obsidian blades, jade chisels. They could shape limestone, which is relatively soft, but some of these stones aren't limestone. They're harder rock, andesite, basalt, materials that should have taken months to shape using the tools we know they had. And yet here they are, fitted together as if someone measured them with calipers. There's another problem. The scale. Some of these lesser structures are huge, not as monumental as the main temples, but still substantial. Building them would have required hundreds of workers, months or years of labor, and a supply chain capable of moving tons of stone through dense jungle terrain. But there's no evidence of nearby quarries, no tool caches, no workers' camps. The stones seem to have appeared here fully formed, and the structures assembled without leaving the traces we'd expect. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean aliens or lost technology or any of that. It means the Maya were better at logistics, planning, and construction than we've given them credit for. It means their methods were more sophisticated, more efficient, and more carefully thought out than our current models account for. But admitting that, means rethinking a lot of assumptions. And there's one more thing, something archaeologists don't like to talk about because it opens too many questions. Some of these lesser structures show signs of multiple building phases, not unusual in itself. The Maya often built on top of older structures, layers upon layers, each new king adding to what came before. But in a few places at Yaxchilan, the older layer is better built than the newer one. Think about that. It suggests that at some point, the people building here lost knowledge, or lost access to skilled workers, or were working under conditions that forced them to cut corners. It's the opposite of what we expect from history. We expect progress. We expect each generation to build on what came before, getting better, more efficient, more advanced. But here, the evidence suggests decline. And that raises uncomfortable questions. What happened? Was it warfare? Environmental collapse? A plague that killed the master builders? We don't know. What we do know is that by the time the Spanish arrived, Yaxchilan had been abandoned for centuries. The jungle had reclaimed it. The knowledge of how to build like this, how to move those stones, shape them, fit them, all of it was gone. Today, the lesser structures of Yaxchilan are a problem without a solution. They're too expensive to excavate, too remote to protect, and too fragile to leave exposed. So they sit in a kind of limbo, slowly being consumed by the jungle, piece by piece, year by year. And with them goes evidence. Every rainy season washes away a little more detail. Every falling tree crushes another section of wall. Every passing decade takes us further from understanding what these people knew. The main plaza at Yaxchilan will survive. It's protected. But these lesser structures, the ones that might hold the real secrets, the anomalies, the techniques that don't fit our models, they're disappearing. And no one's coming to save them. Southern Russia, the Chelyabinsk region, not far from the border with Kazakhstan. The year is 1987, and Soviet archaeologists are conducting a routine survey ahead of a planned reservoir. The area is scheduled to be flooded. They're documenting what will be lost. And then they find Arkaim. At first, it doesn't look like much, a circular anomaly in the landscape, maybe 400 feet across. But as they begin to excavate, carefully, urgently, racing against the reservoir deadline, they realize what they've found: a city, perfectly circular, planned with geometric precision, and 4,000 years old. Arkaim isn't large. At its peak, it probably housed no more than 2,000 people. But it's the design that stops you. Two concentric rings of fortified walls, dwellings built into the walls themselves, sharing common foundations, a central plaza, radial streets connecting the inner and outer rings like spokes on a wheel, and all of it built according to a plan that seems to predate the city itself. This wasn't a settlement that grew organically over generations. This was designed. Someone, or some group, sat down with an understanding of geometry, astronomy, and urban planning, and created a blueprint. And then they built it, in one phase. The walls were made of timber and earth, logs laid horizontally, packed with clay and soil, forming barriers 15 feet thick, strong enough to resist attack, strong enough to provide structural support for the houses built into them, strong enough that their foundations are still visible 40 centuries later. But here's what makes Arkaim genuinely mysterious. The level of sophistication in the design goes far beyond simple defense or efficient use of space. The settlement was oriented to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy that rivals modern surveying. The main gates aligned precisely with the solstices. Certain structures within the inner ring aligned with equinoxes and the movements of the moon. Arkaim was a calendar, a working, functional astronomical observatory built into the structure of a city, and it predates Stonehenge's final phase by several centuries. Russian archaeologists who've studied Arkaim call it the Stonehenge of Russia, though that comparison doesn't quite capture what's unique about it. Stonehenge is a monument. Arkaim was a living community. People raised families here. They worked bronze. They kept livestock. They grew crops in the surrounding steppe. And they did all of it inside a structure designed to track the heavens. The people of Arkaim were part of the Sintashta culture, Indo-European pastoralists who lived on the Eurasian steppe during the Bronze Age. We know they domesticated horses. We know they invented the chariot, the light spoke-wheeled war chariot that would revolutionize warfare across Asia and Europe. But Arkaim suggests they knew a lot more than that. The construction techniques alone are impressive. Each house in the settlement had a hearth, a well, and a food storage area. The wells were connected by channels that drained wastewater away from the living areas, a rudimentary but effective sewage system. Some houses even had small smelting furnaces, suggesting metalworking was done at the household level. Modern archaeologists have tried to understand how the Sintashta people achieved this level of planning and execution, and they keep coming back to one conclusion. These people had knowledge we've lost, not in a mystical sense, in a practical sense. They knew how to survey large areas with precision. They knew how to calculate angles and distances. They knew enough geometry to create perfect circles and radial alignments. And they did all of this without writing, or at least without any writing that survived, which means the knowledge was oral, passed down through generations, held by specialists, priests perhaps, or master builders who memorized complex mathematical relationships and taught them to apprentices. But here's the tragedy. Arkaim was occupied for only about 200 years. Somewhere around 1800 BC, the inhabitants packed up and left. They didn't flee. There's no evidence of war or destruction. They dismantled what they could carry, burned what they couldn't, and moved on. Where? We don't know. The Sintashta culture disappeared from the archaeological record not long after, and with them went the knowledge of how to build like this. Later cultures on the steppe, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the countless nomadic tribes that followed, built nothing like Arkaim. They were mobile. They lived in felt tents and wooden wagons. The idea of creating a permanent, geometrically perfect settlement seems to have died with the Sintashta. In the 1990s, after Arkaim was saved from the reservoir project, Russian archaeologists began a partial reconstruction. They used traditional materials, logs, clay, thatch. They followed the evidence as closely as possible, and they discovered something humbling. Building even a small section of Arkaim's walls took months. The logs had to be selected carefully, not too green, not too dry. The clay had to be mixed with the right amount of straw and sand. The whole structure had to be assembled in the correct sequence, or it would collapse under its own weight. These weren't primitive people throwing together crude shelters. They were engineers, working with organic materials in ways that required deep understanding and generations of accumulated knowledge. Today, Arkaim is a protected archaeological site and a tourist destination. Thousands of people visit every year. Some come for the archaeology. Others come because they believe the site has spiritual significance. There's a whole subculture in Russia that views Arkaim as a sacred place, a connection to ancient Aryan roots. The archaeologists tolerate this mostly, but it complicates things, because the more popular Arkaim becomes as a mystical site, the harder it is to have serious conversations about what the evidence actually shows. And the evidence is strange enough without adding mythology to it. Here's what we know for certain. 4,000 years ago, a group of Bronze Age pastoralists on the Eurasian steppe built a city that functioned as both a home and an observatory. They built it according to a plan that required sophisticated knowledge of geometry and astronomy. They lived there for about 2 centuries, then left. And here's what we don't know. Where did that knowledge come from? How was it preserved? Why did it disappear? And most importantly, what else did they know that we haven't discovered yet? Because Arkaim is just one site. Archaeologists have found dozens of similar settlements across the southern Urals and northern Kazakhstan. The same circular design, the same astronomical alignments, the same sudden appearance and disappearance. It's not an isolated mystery. It's a pattern, and patterns mean knowledge. Knowledge we've lost. Peru, about 200 miles north of Lima, in a valley so dry that rain might fall once a decade. The Casma River flows here, barely, fed by snowmelt from the Andes. And on the northern edge of the valley, half buried under centuries of windblown sand, sits Sechin Bajo. You've probably never heard of it. Most people haven't. But Sechin Bajo might be the oldest monumental stone architecture in the Americas, maybe in the world. Radiocarbon dating puts the earliest construction phase at around 3,500 BC. That's 5,500 years ago. Older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the Ziggurats of Mesopotamia. And yet, it's barely been studied. A handful of excavations in the early 2000s revealed the basics: a massive platform, possibly a temple, with multiple construction phases spanning more than 1,000 years. But funding ran out. Political priorities shifted, and Sechin Bajo sank back into obscurity. Here's what makes Sechin Bajo so unsettling. The people who built it shouldn't have been capable of this. According to the standard archaeological timeline, the Norte Chico civilization, the earliest complex society in the Americas, was just beginning to develop around 3,500 BC. Small fishing villages along the coast, simple agriculture, no pottery, no writing, certainly no monumental architecture. And yet here's Sechin Bajo. The platform is massive, more than 30 feet high in places, covering several acres. The walls are built using cut stone blocks, some weighing several tons. They're not dry stacked like later Andean construction. They're set in mortar. And the mortar itself is engineered, a mixture of clay, sand, and organic material that's held together for 5 millennia. Modern materials scientists have analyzed that mortar. They've tried to replicate it. They can't get it right. The proportions, the curing process, something about how the organic material binds with the clay. It's chemistry we don't fully understand. And this was the Bronze Age. Technically, not even the Bronze Age in the Americas. Copper was being worked, but bronze hadn't been invented yet. So, who built this? And more importantly, why? The platform at Sechin Bajo was clearly ceremonial. There are no signs of domestic occupation, no hearths, no trash middens, no storage rooms. It was a place people came to, not a place they lived. Some archaeologists think it was a temple dedicated to water deities. The Casma Valley is desert, and survival here depends entirely on the river and the seasonal snowmelt from the mountains. A culture that worshipped water, that built monuments to ensure its continued flow, makes sense. But that's speculation. What's not speculation is the construction sequence. Sechin Bajo wasn't built all at once. It was built in phases, each one adding to what came before. The earliest phase, around 3500 BC, used smaller stones and simpler techniques. But by 3000 BC, the construction had become more ambitious. Larger stones, more complex layouts, decorative elements. That suggests knowledge accumulation. Each generation learning from the previous one, refining techniques, pushing the limits of what was possible. It's exactly what we'd expect from a developing civilization. Except we don't see the development. We only see Sechin Bajo. There are no earlier sites with progressively simpler construction. No archaeological record showing the gradual evolution from basic shelter to monumental platform. Sechin Bajo appears, fully formed, with no clear precursor. And that's the mystery. Where did the knowledge come from? Did the builders of Sechin Bajo learn from some other culture we haven't discovered yet? Was there an even older tradition of monumental construction that left no trace? Or did they figure it out themselves, through trial and error, experimentation, and generations of accumulated experience that happened somewhere else, in some place that's now lost to erosion, looting, or simple bad luck? We don't know, and the frustrating part is we might never know, because Sechin Bajo is eroding. The Peruvian coast is harsh. Wind, sun, occasional floods when El Niño brings unexpected rain. The site is unprotected. No roof, no barriers, just open to the elements. Every year, a little more is lost. The exposed walls deteriorate. The buried sections remain stable, but excavating them requires money, permits, and political will, none of which are abundant. When the initial excavations happened, they made international headlines. Briefly, oldest monument in the Americas discovered, a few articles in archaeology journals, some local news coverage, and then silence. Because Sechin Bajo doesn't fit the narrative. It's too old, too sophisticated. It raises questions about how civilization develops, questions that don't have easy answers. And academia, like any human institution, sometimes prefers easy answers. But the stones don't care about narratives. They sit there, patient, 5,000 years old and counting, waiting for someone to figure out what they mean. Here's what haunts me about Sechin Bajo. It's not just that it's old, it's that it represents a beginning, the beginning of monumental architecture in the Americas. The first time someone said, "We're going to build something permanent, something that will outlast us," and they succeeded. Whatever else we don't know about the people who built Sechin Bajo, we know they understood permanence. They built something that would still be standing 5,000 years later, in an age they couldn't possibly imagine, for people they would never meet. And we can't even figure out how they made the mortar. Central Iran, about 150 miles south of Tehran. The landscape here has been inhabited for more than 8,000 years, one of the longest continuously occupied regions on Earth. And rising from the desert like a broken tooth sits Tepe Sialk, the Ziggurat. Tepe Sialk isn't well known outside of archaeology. It doesn't have the fame of the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, Ur, Babylon, the great towers of Sumer. But it's older than most of them, and in some ways more mysterious. The ziggurat was built sometime around 3000 BC, possibly earlier. It's hard to date precisely because mud brick doesn't preserve well, and the site has been looted, damaged, and rebuilt multiple times over the millennia. But what's clear is that it was massive. The base covers roughly an acre. The structure originally rose in stepped tiers, at least 3, possibly 4 or 5, reaching a height that may have exceeded 100 feet. At the top would have been a temple or shrine, long since collapsed. But it's not the size that makes Tepe Sialk interesting. It's the engineering. Building with mud brick is deceptively difficult. Mud is cheap, abundant, and easy to work with. But it's also heavy, unstable, and vulnerable to water. A structure made entirely of mud brick will slump, crack, and collapse under its own weight unless it's designed very carefully. The builders of Tepe Sialk understood this. They didn't just stack bricks, they engineered the structure from the ground up. The foundation is wider than the upper levels, distributing weight. The bricks themselves are made with varying ratios of clay, sand, and organic temper, each level using the mix best suited to its load-bearing requirements. And they used bitumen. Bitumen is a petroleum product that seeps naturally from the ground in parts of Iran. The ancient builders used it as waterproofing, coating certain layers of brick to prevent moisture from wicking up through the structure. It's an elegant solution, and it worked. Sections of the ziggurat that were treated with bitumen are still relatively intact. Sections without it have eroded away. But here's where Tepe Sialk becomes genuinely puzzling. We don't know who built it. The site was occupied by various cultures over thousands of years. Proto-Elamites, Kassites, Medes, Persians, all of them left traces, pottery, tools, burials, but none of them claimed credit for the ziggurat, and the architectural style doesn't match any known culture. It's not quite Mesopotamian, not quite Elamite. It's something in between, or something else entirely. French archaeologists excavated Tepe Sialk in the 1930s and again in the 1970s. They documented what they could, but the site is so degraded that reconstructing the original design is nearly impossible. What they did discover, though, is that the ziggurat sits on top of even older structures, layers upon layers, settlements dating back to 6000 BC or earlier. Some of the oldest pottery ever found came from the lower levels of Tepe Sialk. This wasn't a sudden construction project. This was a sacred site, built and rebuilt over millennia, each generation adding to what came before, honoring the past while reaching toward the heavens. And that's the function of a ziggurat, really. It's not just a temple. It's a statement, a way of saying, we're here. We've mastered this land. We're reaching toward the gods. But it's also practical. In flat desert terrain, a ziggurat serves as a landmark, a navigation point, a place that can be seen from miles away, guiding travelers and merchants. Tepe Sialk would have been visible for miles. Anyone traveling the ancient trade routes through Iran would have known they were approaching Kashan when they saw the tower. But there's another layer to this, something most people don't talk about. Some of the bricks at Tepe Sialk bear marks, not accidental, deliberate, symbols pressed into the wet clay before firing. No one knows what they mean. They're not part of any known writing system. They might be masons' marks, signatures of the workers who made the bricks, or they might be something else. Prayers, protective spells, records we can't read. Dozens of different symbols have been found. Some appear repeatedly, others show up only once. There's a pattern, but it's a pattern we don't understand. And that's the tragedy of Tepe Sialk. It's a repository of knowledge we can't access. The people who built it didn't leave written records, or if they did, none have survived. The symbols on the bricks might be the closest thing we have to their voice, and we can't hear it. Today, Tepe Sialk is a protected site. Technically, there's a fence, a gate, a caretaker who lives nearby, but there's no museum, no visitor center, very little in the way of interpretation or preservation. It sits there, slowly eroding, while the modern city of Kashan sprawls closer each year. And here's what gets me. This structure has stood for 5,000 years. It survived Alexander the Great. It survived the Arab conquests. It survived Genghis Khan. It survived the rise and fall of a dozen empires. But it might not survive the 21st century, because mud brick doesn't last forever. Even the best engineered structure will eventually fail. And without active preservation, constant maintenance, monitoring, repairs, Tepe Sialk will collapse. Maybe not today, maybe not in our lifetimes, but soon, in archaeological terms. And when it does, we'll lose more than just a building. We'll lose evidence, context, a direct physical connection to people who lived 5,000 years ago and built something that touches the sky. They built it to last, and it has, longer than they could have imagined. The question is, will we let it stand? New Mexico, the Pajarito Plateau, about 40 miles northwest of Santa Fe. The landscape here is dramatic, carved from layers of volcanic ash that compressed into soft, porous rock called tuff. And carved into those cliffs, sometimes 100 feet above the canyon floor, are dwellings, hundreds of them. Most people who visit Bandelier National Monument see the main loop trail, the reconstructed kiva, the cliff dwellings with their wooden ladders and interpretive signs. It's impressive, educational, a glimpse into how the ancestral Pueblo people lived 600-700 years ago. But that's not where the mystery is. Walk farther into the canyon system, into the areas that aren't on the tourist maps, that require permits and a willingness to scramble over rough terrain, and you'll find something else. Stone structures that don't match the ancestral Pueblo pattern, masonry that's more sophisticated than it should be, and techniques that archaeologists still can't fully explain. The ancestral Pueblo people were master builders. We know this. Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonito. They created architectural wonders using stone, adobe, and timber. Their techniques are well documented, studied, and understood. But some of the structures at Bandelier don't fit that pattern. The stones are too uniform, the cutting too precise. The mortar, when mortar was used at all, is a composition that doesn't match other ancestral Pueblo sites in the region. It's harder, more durable, mixed with something that gives it almost concrete-like properties. And then there are the cavates, the carved caves. Most of them are exactly what you'd expect. Round or oval chambers carved into the soft tuff, with simple tool marks visible on the walls. Homes, storage rooms, ceremonial spaces. But a few are different. The surfaces are too smooth, almost polished, as if the rock was somehow softened, shaped, and then hardened again. That sounds impossible. And maybe it is. Maybe it's just erosion, or a natural variation in the rock that created the effect by accident. But it's strange enough that researchers have noticed it. Strange enough that they don't have a good explanation. There's another problem. Some of the cavates are positioned in places that shouldn't be accessible, high on the cliff face, with no obvious way to reach them. No handholds, no ledges, no sign of the wooden scaffolding that would have been needed to carve them. How did they get up there? Ropes, probably. Wooden ladders that rotted away centuries ago. It's the most logical explanation, but the precision required to carve a dwelling while hanging from ropes, working in a position where a single mistake could mean death. That's a level of skill and courage that's hard to comprehend. And here's what makes it more mysterious. Some of these high cavates show no evidence of domestic use, no soot from fires, no worn floors, no storage niches. They're empty, pristine, as if they were carved for a purpose we don't understand. Ceremonial spaces, observatories, burial chambers that were later emptied. No one knows. What we do know is that the people who lived in Bandelier Canyon were part of a larger culture that thrived in the region from roughly 1150 to 1550 AD. They grew maize, beans, and squash on the mesa tops. They hunted deer and rabbits. They created intricate pottery, decorated with geometric and animal designs. And then, around 1550, they left. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, over a few decades, the canyon was abandoned. The people moved, some to the Rio Grande Valley, where their descendants still live in pueblos today. Others scattered, joining different communities, adapting, surviving. Why did they leave? Drought is the conventional answer. Tree ring data shows a prolonged dry period in the late 1500s. Water would have been scarce. Crops would have failed. Moving to areas with more reliable water sources makes sense, but the canyon has a permanent stream. Game animals would have remained. It's not like the land became uninhabitable, we're guessing, because the ancestral Pueblo people didn't leave written records. Their history is oral, passed down through generations, and those stories belong to their descendants, the modern Pueblo people, who don't always share them with outsiders. And that's their right. But it means we're left with stones and silence, trying to reconstruct not just how these people lived, but why they made the choices they made, why they carved certain cavates high on the cliffs, why they built certain structures with such care and others more simply. And here's the uncomfortable part. Some of the most refined stonework at Bandelier, the walls with the tightest joints, the most carefully shaped blocks, are in structures that appear to be older than the main occupation period. That's the opposite of what we expect. We expect technology and skill to progress over time. We expect later structures to be more sophisticated than earlier ones. But at Bandelier, in some cases, it's reversed, which suggests either that the dating is wrong, which is possible, dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating have margins of error, or that the people who first built here had skills that were somehow lost or de-emphasized by later generations. And if that's true, it raises questions about cultural continuity, about how knowledge is preserved, about what happens when mastercraft people die without passing on their techniques. Today, Bandelier is protected. The National Park Service maintains the trails, stabilizes the structures, conducts ongoing archaeological research. But the remote sections, the areas with the anomalous stonework, the high cavates, the structures that don't fit the pattern, Those are largely left alone, too fragile to open to the public, too remote to easily study, too expensive to excavate comprehensively, so they sit, slowly eroding, occasionally visited by researchers who document, photograph, and puzzle over what they're seeing. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some places are meant to keep their secrets. Maybe the people who built these structures would prefer that we didn't understand them completely, that we respected their work without claiming to own their knowledge. But it's frustrating for those of us who want to understand, who see the evidence of sophisticated engineering and want to know how it was done, who look at the high cavates and want to know why. The ancestral Pueblo people lived here for 400 years. They raised families, conducted ceremonies, watched the stars, carved their homes into living rock. They knew this canyon in ways we never will. And they left, taking their knowledge with them, the knowledge of how to shape stone so precisely, how to reach impossible heights, how to live in harmony with this harsh, beautiful landscape. The stones remain, waiting, patient, holding their secrets. Azerbaijan, about 40 miles southwest of Baku, in a landscape that feels ancient, windswept, harsh, timeless. And scattered across the hillsides, on boulders and rock faces, are images, thousands of them. Gobustan is one of the largest and oldest rock art sites in the world. The carvings here span 40,000 years. Read that again. 40,000 years. From the Upper Paleolithic, when our ancestors were still sharing the world with Neanderthals, all the way to the medieval period. That's not a single culture. That's hundreds of cultures, millennia of human occupation, each group leaving their mark, adding their voice to a conversation that spans the entire length of human civilization. But it's not the age that makes Gobustan mysterious. Age alone doesn't make something impossible to understand. It's the content and the techniques. Some of the oldest images at Gobustan, dating back 20, 30, 40,000 years, show a level of artistic skill that shouldn't exist, not according to the standard narrative of human development. We're taught that art evolved gradually. Crude stick figures gave way to more realistic representations. Simple scratches became sophisticated compositions. Progress, development, evolution. But at Gobustan, it doesn't work that way. Some of the oldest images are the most realistic. Detailed depictions of animals, horses, bulls, gazelles, with anatomically correct proportions, dynamic poses, and an understanding of perspective. And some of the newer images, carved just a few hundred years ago, are simpler, more stylized, less concerned with realism. It's as if the earliest artists had skills that were later lost, or de-emphasized, or simply not valued in the same way by subsequent cultures. And that raises a question we're not supposed to ask. What if human capability hasn't always progressed in a straight line? What if there have been peaks and valleys, times when people knew more, and times when knowledge was forgotten? The techniques used to create these petroglyphs are another mystery. Most were made by pecking, repeatedly striking the rock surface with a harder stone, gradually removing material to create an image. It's labor-intensive, time-consuming, and for the older images, it would have required stone tools. But some of the petroglyphs show cuts, clean, straight lines that look almost incised rather than pecked. How? What tool could create that effect? Not copper. There's no evidence of copper working in this region during the time periods when these particular images were made. Not bronze, not iron. Some researchers think the artists might have used flint or obsidian blades, sharp enough to score the rock surface. It's plausible, but no one's been able to replicate the effect convincingly using only Stone Age tools. And then there's the subject matter. What are these images depicting? Most of them are straightforward enough. Animals, hunting scenes, dancers, boats. Lots of boats, actually, which tells us the Caspian Sea was central to life here, and human figures engaged in what might be rituals or ceremonies, but some images are harder to interpret. Geometric patterns, spirals, grids, arrays of dots and lines that might be symbolic or might be representational in ways we don't understand. Are they maps, star charts, counting systems, abstract art? We don't know. We're projecting our own interpretations onto images created by people who saw the world differently than we do, who had different concerns, different cosmologies, different ways of encoding meaning. And without written language to accompany the images, we're guessing. There's one petroglyph at Gobustan that's particularly strange. It's been called the Star Map, though that name is controversial. It shows a cluster of dots arranged in a pattern that some researchers believe corresponds to the constellation Taurus, as it would have appeared in the night sky around 10,000 years ago. If true, and that's a big if, it would mean the people here were tracking celestial objects and recording them with enough accuracy to be recognizable millennia later. It would mean they understood astronomy in ways we associate with much later cultures, but it's contested. Other archaeologists think the pattern is coincidental, or that it represents something else entirely, a hunting map perhaps, or a territorial marker. The problem with interpreting rock art is that we bring our assumptions with us. We see what we want to see. A scientist sees a star map. An anthropologist sees a ritual symbol. A hunter sees a territorial marker. All of them might be right, or all of them might be wrong. What's undeniable is the scale. Gobustan isn't a single rock with a few carvings. It's an entire landscape transformed into a gallery. For 40,000 years, people came here, climbed these hills, and left their mark. Why here? What made this place special? There's fresh water nearby. The Caspian Sea is close, providing fish and trade routes. The location offers good visibility. You can see anyone approaching from miles away. All practical reasons. But that doesn't explain the art. You don't carve thousands of images into stone just because the location is practical. You do it because the place means something, because it's sacred, or significant, or worth the effort of permanent commemoration. And here's the haunting part. We don't know what happened to most of the cultures that created these images. The artists who carved the oldest petroglyphs 40,000 years ago, their descendants are gone, scattered, absorbed into other populations, or simply extinct, as countless human groups have been throughout history. But the images remain. A hand, preserved in ochre pigment, reaching across 40 millennia. A direct connection to someone who stood on this exact spot, looked at this same sky, and decided to leave evidence of their existence. Today, Gobustan is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's protected, studied, and visited by thousands of tourists every year. But the petroglyphs continue to erode. Wind, rain, the rare snow, even the touch of too many hands. Conservationists do what they can. They monitor the most vulnerable images. They create digital records. They limit access to certain areas. but there's only so much that can be done. Rock art, by its nature, is exposed, vulnerable, temporary, in the long arc of geological time. And every year, a few more images are lost. The details soften, the lines blur. In another 1,000 years, many of the petroglyphs that exist today will be unrecognizable. But new discoveries continue. Every few years, researchers find previously unknown panels hidden in remote areas or simply overlooked. Gobustan is vast, and it hasn't been fully catalogued, which means there are still voices we haven't heard, still images waiting to be found, still questions we haven't thought to ask. 40,000 years. That's longer than writing, longer than agriculture, longer than cities, longer than everything we think of as civilization. And for all of that time, people have been coming to Gobustan, looking at the sky, looking at the land, and leaving their mark, saying, "We were here, we saw, we understood, even if you can't." 11 places, 4 continents, 40,000 years of human ingenuity, ambition, and mystery. We've walked through ruins that predate the pyramids. We've examined stonework that modern engineers can't replicate. We've stood in observatories that tracked stars we're only now beginning to understand. And we've looked at art created by people whose names we'll never know, whose languages are lost, whose stories died with them. And here's what all 11 of these places have in common. They were built by people who didn't have our tools, our technology, our education. They didn't have computers, or cranes, or steel, or electricity. What they had was knowledge, hard-won, carefully preserved, passed down through generations. Knowledge of materials, of mathematics, of astronomy, of engineering principles that we're still trying to reverse engineer from the ruins they left behind. And they had patience, the kind of patience that builds something knowing you won't live to see it finished. The kind of patience that carves rock for 40 years to create an image that will last 40,000. The kind of patience that plants a forest for your great-great-grandchildren to walk through. We live in an age of speed. We want answers immediately. We want progress measured in quarters, not centuries. We tear down and rebuild constantly, chasing efficiency, chasing profit, chasing the next thing. And in the process, we've lost something these ancient builders understood instinctively. Permanence matters, legacy matters. Building something that will outlast you, that matters. But here's the question that haunts me, and maybe it haunts you too. If these people, without our advantages, without our technology, could build things that still stand thousands of years later, what are we building that will last? Not our skyscrapers. Most modern buildings have a design life of 50, maybe 100 years. Not our roads or bridges. Those need constant maintenance just to remain functional. Not our digital records. Storage formats become obsolete. Servers fail. Data degrades. In 5,000 years, will any trace of our civilization remain? Or will we be as mysterious to future archaeologists as the builders of Por-Bazhyn are to us? The people who built these 11 places understood something we're in danger of forgetting. They understood that knowledge isn't just facts. It's not just data stored in databases. It's understanding, encoded in practice, passed down through teaching, preserved in the physical world. When a master builder dies without training an apprentice, that knowledge dies. When a culture is destroyed, millennia of accumulated wisdom can vanish in a generation. When we stop asking, how did they do that? and start assuming we're inherently superior, we stop learning. And that's the real mystery of these places. Not just how they were built, but what we've lost. What knowledge, what techniques, what understanding of the natural world has slipped through our fingers because we didn't recognize its value until it was gone. The builders of Paquimé knew something about copper metallurgy we've forgotten. The people at Ingapirca shaped stone with tools we can barely identify. The Sintashta designed cities with astronomical precision we're only now beginning to appreciate. The Zapotec watched stars we didn't know mattered. The Quilmes built walls that outlasted empires. And at Yaxchilan, Arkaim, Sechin Bajo, Tepe Sialk, Bandelier, and Gobustan, the story is the same. Knowledge, skill, patience, and then silence. But silence doesn't mean absence. These places are still speaking. You just have to listen. You have to slow down. You have to approach with humility instead of assumptions. You have to admit that maybe, just maybe, the people who came before us weren't primitive. They were different. They knew different things. They solved problems we've forgotten existed. And if we're willing to learn from them, if we're willing to study these ruins not as curiosities, but as textbooks written in stone, maybe we can recover some of what's been lost. Maybe we can build better, last longer, think farther ahead than the next quarterly report or election cycle. Maybe we can remember how to be ancestors worth remembering. 11 mysteries, 11 invitations to wonder, 11 reminders that human beings are capable of remarkable things when they think beyond themselves. The stones are still there, still teaching, still waiting for us to ask the right questions. Maybe it's time we started listening.